Dynamic voices for a diverse church. This is Pass the Mic.
Greetings and God bless. Welcome to another episode of Pass the Mic, Dynamic Voices for a Diverse Church, powered by The Witness, a Black Christian collective. I'm your host, Tyler Burns. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Burns Clan. Please follow at your own risk. And joining me today is the man behind the podcast, the man behind PTM. Of course, you saw him on our PTM retrospective. Of course, he is Mr. Award winning. Of course, he is, how would I describe this? I was getting ready to say famous comic commentator. I think that feels right.
That can't be accurate.
It has to be. Of course, I'm talking about the Beau York. Beau, what's going on, brother?
Man, listen, Tyler, you were like, see, this is the thing. We've been working together for over 10 years now, and there's always been in the back of my head, like, when are we gonna find like the hype man for Tyler? Because like you've crushed it. You've set the bar so high, it's impossible to find somebody to be your hype man, and it's so frustrating because, man, you talk about pastor, you talk about podcaster, you talk about another podcaster, you talk about another podcast. You've been on so many podcasts that, like, the other day I was actually looking at your bio and I was like, wait, he was on what? Wait, he's on what? And I was like, I literally went down a Tyler Burns Wikipedia rabbit hole trying to figure out all of the various things that you've been a part of and done. It's insane. But man, thanks so much for having me.
Man, listen, I'm excited to hype up my people. I tell the mentees and some of the young guns that I get the opportunity to encourage and pour into that I'm just excited to hype people up. And, I don't feel like I'm the type of person that needs to be propped up or elevated or anything. I just want to elevate the people around me. So that's what's most important, man. That's the role.
I appreciate you, brother. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being on. Listen, I want to tell our listeners, we have some exciting episodes coming up. Jamar's, obviously, Jamar's world traveling. So Jamar's going to be back soon. We got some incredible episodes coming up. We're going to be talking about Gaza. We're going to be talking about Diddy. We're going to be talking about fraternities and sororities, the Divine Nine. That one's coming. So many amazing episodes. And we couldn't do this without you. So patreon.com/pass the mic. If you can support us just for $1 per episode, you can keep this thing going. Thank you all so much for your constant support, your DMs, your emails. I've seen people in person. People at my church have mentioned listening to the podcast and being encouraged by it. So shout out to the listeners. We couldn't do it without them, right, Beau?
Man, and since I'm behind the scenes, I'll even pull the curtain back a little bit more. Last couple of weeks, it's been difficult. It's been rough, y'all. There's been some things going on behind the scenes in terms of scheduling and everything else. And when I say that it is because of our patrons that we have been able to put out the episodes we've been able to put out, like, it is literally because of y'all. So thank y'all so very much to those of you who are already supporting. And if you've ever considered it, please head over there, patreon.com/pass the mic.
So, Beau, what we talking about today, man? What's on your heart to talk about?
Oh, man. So you and I were talking right before we were recording. And I mean, obviously we've both been kind of following the kind of, it's odd to even say controversy because there's so little known about what exactly is going on, but what's going on specifically with Tony Evans, who of course, pastor of a mega church for a couple of decades now, and has built this massive platform. How many?
I think 40 years.
Recently, for those that don't know, he has stepped down, citing that there was some sin, unnamed, unspecified, a couple of years ago, an unspecific amount of years ago that occurred. And for that reason, he's stepping back from what came out very recently in the last few days. His son has said that the family is as clueless as to what this is as everybody else, but they're trying to support the father in this moment and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of speculation as to what this could be. There's a lot of, maybe some easy threads to go down.
Right.
But I think for us, what we're most interested in is, how does this happen? How does this always happen where it's these pastors of these mega churches that get kind of called to the mat, that have to that end up exposed? I don't know. How would you set this up? Because obviously I have an angle I want to go to with this, but obviously this hits close to home to you as an actual pastor, not a pastor of a mega church, but as an actual pastor.
Well, I've been in one, and having been intimately involved in the behind the scenes of one and seeing how it runs, and also seeing some of the challenges, seeing some of the pressures. I
And this
definitely
wasn't your
have a
father's church,
perspective.
is that correct?
Yes, absolutely was my father's church.
Oh, it was
So
your father's
at
church.
one
Okay.
point it was 5,000 members.
Oh, wow.
So definitely would. I think there's two things that I naturally think. So number one, I would say mega church, quote unquote, is relative, right? So when people say, oh, something is a mega church, in some context back then, the delineation and the distinguisher of what a mega church is was over 1,000 members. So
Really?
that was a mega church. And now probably I'd have to go back and look at the specific data, but probably any church from like 6 to 800 would also be considered a mega church because the average size of a church in America is 50 members, I think, something like that.
That's
So
so
that's the
interesting. So,
average size of a church, or maybe I actually think less than 50 members. So the average size of a church is not in the hundreds. The average size of a church would probably be under 50 members or so, especially post COVID.
that's fascinating because to me, megachurch, oddly enough, I don't think numbers as in like, okay, once you hit this number, you're a megachurch. That makes sense. To me, megachurch means that this is a church where kind of the pastoral influence or pastoral authority extends beyond their region. So that the church is actually, it's people tuning in from like 3 states over or something of that nature, where you've got this influence to the point where you are almost no longer just a pastor.
Right.
You're also now, to some effect, a celebrity.
So this is the second part that I think is really helpful. So I don't know anybody from the Evans family. I don't know anything about the Texas church world in terms of personally, right? But what I will say is I think it is fascinating to see how much of pastoring today is kind of built on platform building. And I say
Mm.
this on a platform that was
Hmm.
built. I think it's just fascinating how much of it is platform building, how much of it is content generation, influencer marketing, just some of the natural dynamics of what is an avenue for ministry to take place, but it's also potentially a pitfall in terms of how your platform can overshadow the purpose of why you got into ministry. And so I think people are asking some legitimate questions about, well, what's the tension and balance between you being out there and you being at home and local. And this is something I'm personally, as a leader and as a pastor, wrestling with as well. What's this tension point between my local responsibility and then when the local grows so much that now people outside of the region are watching, taking note, and then wanting you to then say, oh, okay, go and do this elsewhere or go and influence other regions or other churches. And I think that's tricky. And I think that's really, it's a tough balance because I think we're talking about mega churches, but then there's another level of what about mega personalities,
What
right?
and is there such a thing as a mega church that doesn't have a mega personality behind it? You know what I mean? Like and maybe there is, but is there a church that you know of that the church is like the celebrity more so than the actual pastor or a personality?
You know what's funny? I recently was at a gathering earlier this week, and a pastor friend of mine was hosting kind of this private gathering with some Black leaders. And it was just to encourage, to challenge, to talk about emotional health, to kind of really dig down deep into our hearts. And I was blown away by the people who were there that I didn't know before. So I think there's a level to which I've seen all variations of what a quote unquote mega church has looked like. I've seen the
Hmm.
common big pastor, big personality. I've also seen a little bit of the team model, right? Like the team model of how people have kind of built it together because the mission and the vision of the church has been what has actually attracted people. And then I've seen the model of people not even being on social media but pastoring huge churches. you know,
Right,
I've
right.
seen that, so and I especially think that younger Black leaders um are actually taking note of some of the things that have happened on a mass scale and then kind of looking at it and saying, I want to then adjust how I do ministry. I want to adjust my life. I want to adjust my accountability structures. I want to adjust all these things so that I can at least protect the church from the personality, from the central figure of the church. And I think that's a healthy shift. But what I've seen is I've met a lot of people, even recently, that nobody knows, but are doing tremendous work. And I
Mm-mm.
and I think it kind of makes the old school 90s, early 2000s idea of what a mega church is, it kind of nuances it a little bit for me.
But see, that's the thing, right? Tony Evans represents that era of megachurch because you're exactly right. These days, it's less about the celebrity pastor and it's more about the influencer pastor, right? Somebody who's, their TikTok video goes viral, probably for the wrong reason. And then, they blow up. And with, especially in a post COVID world where so much of the churching is happening online, and typically it's not in a sermon, it's typically in kind of micro lectures, 5 to 7 minutes is like, hey, that's that's your sermon right there. Go
And
ahead.
and I do want to say some of this is certain people were, you talk about, we're talking about comic books a lot. Certain people are like Bane, right? They were formed in it, molded by it, right? So I
Right.
think you're gonna see Gen Z naturally has gifts we don't have. So the ability to build a platform quickly, a lot of the people don't realize this. Well, actually, if they went back and listened to the behind the mic, they would understand. But not the voice, but the microphone. But I think PTM, it was kind of an accident how this all happened. Like the witness is kind of an accident, like we didn't have some 15-year plan where we were like, we gonna do this and we gonna be in the millions and all this. That was kind of an accident, right? Like it wasn't necessarily like, yes, we felt like we had influence and the ability to build it, but it wasn't some grand scheme. And I think now there's strategies, systems, playbooks, blueprints that can build that. And I think Gen Z is just naturally more capable. So when I say influencer pastor, I don't say that as a shot. I say that as kind of the times that we live in. That's kind
Oh
of the
yeah.
reality in the air that we breathe.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think, and then so if you think about kind of with these larger audiences, right? So you have your kind of 90s era mega pastors that are starting to get older and either are largely currently in controversy, have a line of controversies associated with them, or we just all anticipate the line of controversies to come. Like it's all kind of tied up in there. Then you have these modern day influencer pastors who are generally, there's some controversies spread throughout, but because they've been brought up in this space, are a little bit more aware. Hopefully, that's the accountability that they're holding together for the ministry. Might be more of accountability they're holding together to protect their own self image. Regardless, again, I'm probably going to come at this with a little bit more of a negative bent, so I'll go ahead and
No, I
kind of
think that's fair, bro.
pull
That's
my
fair. Go
bias
ahead.
there.
I
But
think there's
then
some people that are gonna naturally say what you're they're gonna say, oh, you're saying what I'm thinking. So I want you to go there.
I did ask before we clicked record if Tyler if he just wanted me to interview him on this or if he wanted me to share my thoughts because I was going to have some thoughts if he wanted me to share some thoughts. But then there's that third person, and this is the person that you were referring to earlier, who nobody knows. They're doing good work in their community. Or at least their church is growing in their community. Uh, it's got the numbers that by some accounts in maybe like a 90s era type of way would have been considered a mega church, maybe even in today's numbers in terms of just the amount of audience they've got would be considered a mega church, but we don't know who they are. They're completely unknown to us. They're known to their congregation, but they're not
Right.
necessarily known to us. So all of these individuals kind of fall into this category, let's just say, of being these mega pastors, perhaps,
Right.
right? Because in the form of an influencer, they might not have they might have a church, but it might not be their church, and yet it satisfies the same thing. And I'm curious, is it time for all of that to go? Is it time for the mega church, the 90s era mega church? Let's do the easy one, right? Is the 90s era mega church dead? Is it time for that to go? And I say this, by the way, dear listener, from Houston, Texas. We are known for
Right.
having a couple of mega churches right
Of
here. And
course.
I'm wondering, can I stop looking at this dude smiling at me and well, never mind. I shouldn't. No, I'm not going to.
I think it's a good question. I think the first thing I would say is any any brand and form of church that is built upon the personality of a man or a woman, that is built upon growing according to business metrics, and is built upon extending its reach based upon marketing alone is going to fail sooner rather than later. And by fail, I don't necessarily mean end in burning scandal. What I'm more so talking about is going to fail the mission of why the church was established and founded to begin with, right? Which is the bigger question, which is we're talking about scandals as if that's the only way to fail, right? And very easy for people to point fingers at scandals, right? It's a necessary conversation, but it's easy to point fingers at scandals because those are the glamorous ways in which churches or pastors or leaders fail. Truth of the matter is you can fail and still succeed. That's the bigger issue. The bigger issue is what was the purpose of the church, as we talk about almost all the time here at PTM. What's the purpose of this thing? What's the purpose of this community? What's the purpose of people gathered together? And so I think that the greater problem is it's easy for us to build a successful ministry and fail the mission. And so I think any church that's built upon long term, because in the early days, a lot of this is lifting off the ground. A lot of it is natural. You've got a leader or leaders that are kind of developing something, recruiting people, evangelizing, all these types of things. And that's a tricky balance in the early days of a ministry, which is where I'm at, right? That's a tricky balance because sometimes you can de-emphasize yourself and people will still emphasize you. You keep de-emphasizing yourself, people will still emphasize you. You're like, yo, I mean it. I want you to de-emphasize me. No, we want to honor you. It's like, no, but
people want a king, man. The people always want a king.
Exactly. A very thin line to walk as a pastor and a leader. And so you almost have to be ruthless in de-emphasizing yourself in some way to protect not just you, but also to protect people from what they think they want. And that's hard. So this is very difficult. So in the American context and how we structure church and how we think about it, yeah, if anything long-term is built around the personality, around business models and metrics alone, around marketing and slick social media as a way to attract and recruit people alone, whatever version that is going to fail. It doesn't matter if it's 90s, 2000s, 2024, it's going to fail. There's no way it survives.
But see, okay, that's true. That's absolutely true. But isn't that also kind of obvious, right? Like at the end of the day, like I guess my question is the problem with something like a megachurch more about the back-end infrastructure and even like lack of accountability that, be it money, be it morality, whatever you have, is that the problem with a megachurch? Or is that just a problem with church? Because the reality is the megachurch pastors, they come up with these scandals, okay, so somebody like Tony Evans, obviously that's going to be national news. Like obviously, because this is a celebrity pastor who everybody knows. He's been a political influencer at times. This is somebody who's got, this mega platform that he's a household name. So when he's caught up in controversy, we're all going to be aware of that. It's not going to just impact his church. It is going to impact his church pretty significantly because we all know about it. And the same thing to some extent is true of an influencer. Influencer gets hit with controversy if it's somebody that is broadly known, has a couple of million subscribers, whatever it is. It's a talking point, at least to, a certain age group or whatnot. That's going to impact that person and the team that is around that person, and the audience that follows that person is going to be kind of given this choice. But both of those individuals are going to be held accountable in a way that one megachurch pastor who nobody knows isn't. Because when that person messes up, it's a much easier cover-up. There's not somebody waiting in the wings to blackmail you, which I'm not saying is what's going on with Tony Evans. Not saying that's what's going on. I'm just saying that I'm not saying that.
Yeah, who knows?
There's not going to be that level is probably not going to be there. You've got you talk about a lack of accountability, that you've got that exact same system of lack of accountability. Plus you don't necessarily have all of the eyes of America looking in on you in that 24/7. So is it, and let's push it one step further. What about the church where it is just 50 people? What about the abuses? What about the scandals?
Right.
What about the thing that's going on there?
Exactly.
Even like the smaller you get, then the less eyes are in there and the more abuse can happen. I'm not making an argument. This is why megachurch is good. If anything, I'm
Right.
making an argument that this problem is not just when something gets too big to fail, but perhaps the institution itself is so ripe for corruption that
Yeah.
it needs to be examined from the root all the way to the stem.
Absolutely. I think that's what I would say. I would say number one is these abuses happen in big churches, medium-sized churches, small churches, church plants, longevity churches, historic churches. I mean, we're not talking a lot about it right now because it's not necessarily in our ecosystem, but the conversation around Ebony Marshall Turnham and Abyssinian, Baptist Church in New York in terms of their hiring bias against her as a woman. I mean, all these things, that's a historic Black church, right? And then you've got church plants and you got newer churches, longer churches. So I think there's actually two things I found that have been very interesting. I think number one is accountability, and I think that's true. Like, we definitely need accountability. And what accountability is, I think for some people, they have to understand is you need the level of accountability that fits the culture, the dynamic, and also the pitfalls that are in your specific context. So I think for some people, and the reason I say this is for some people, they're like, oh, I've got this, I've got that. And they think like, oh, that's it. It's like, no, you actually probably, I know as a younger pastor, I actually probably need more accountability than less. And I'm not saying, oh, as I get older, I won't need as much accountability. I just know right now, I'm a young pastor. And so I probably need more accountability rather than the regular level of accountability, right? It's actually a conversation I'm having right now. Like, I'm having a conversation right now with some of our leaders. How do I actually step up my accountability, bring more people into the process? Because I think it's easy for people to assume about younger pastors. Like, there's just there's a strength, there's a vigor, there's a charisma. So I'm like, I actually probably need a little bit more accountability than less.
Right.
And that's going to probably change some things that we do at our church as a result. But so there's accountability. But then I think the second thing, which is kind of the hidden thing in all of this, is longevity, right? How much does success keep you in a position you should have vacated? How much does success keep you in a space that you should have actually let go of? And I think that's kind of maybe the sneaky trap that people don't realize. Longevity might really get you.
All right. Yes. Let's talk about longevity. I like what you're saying. I don't disagree, but I do wonder if it's far enough. I want to hear more about that. Let's take a quick commercial break and we'll be right back here on Pass the Mic.
Hey everybody, this is Tyler.
This is Dr. Jamar Tisby.
And we are excited that you're listening to this episode of Pass the Mic, but let me encourage you to support us. You can do so by going to patreon.com/Pass the Mic. And for just $1 an episode.
Just $1?
Now that's the bare minimum. That's 4 quarters. But if you want to go higher,
Okay,
5, 10,
higher.
15,
That's
20,
right.
25, whatever it is, that will keep this show going and keep the high quality that hopefully you enjoy. So thank you for listening, but you can take it to the next level.
Patreon.com/Pass the Mic. We appreciate you. Hey folks, Dr. Jamar Tisby here, and I want to make sure that you know about the Justice Takes Sides brand. This is merchandise, this is apparel to help you represent your values. This is about getting people off the sidelines and into the struggle for justice that's ongoing today. Go visit justicetakeSides.com, get your merchandise and apparel there, and follow us on Instagram at Justice Takes Sides.
All right, we're back on Pass the Mic. We're talking, is the megachurch dead? Are we seeing the death of the megachurch? Should the megachurch be dead? Is it just megachurches? That's what we're talking about here with Pastor Tyler Burns host of this podcast, and yet I've stepped in. I've done the ad transition. I've completely messed up everything. But I've seen you do it so well. I'm like, oh, this is the time I should.
Man, stop.
I'm learning from you. And I'm also,
Stop, man.
I'm just trying to be on that Tyler Burns level. Anyway, you're talking longevity, man.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think for a lot of us, we just assume success makes it hard to transition. Success makes it hard to re-clarify. Success makes it hard to really lock down the things and address the things that need to be. Success just makes things so difficult. And I think it can also keep us in spaces we're not intended to be. So, I mean, and I don't mind being very open about this. I'm looking at it and I'm saying, I can't imagine being at my church for 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I just can't imagine.
To say that lately, actually. I've noticed that.
I can't imagine
You've
that.
been kind of like signaling that that's the case.
Absolutely. I say quite regularly, nobody in this church is indispensable, not even me. Mm-hmm. God can put in a new pastor and y'all will be good. What really is the truth is, are we going to keep our hearts and our minds centered around why we exist as a body of believers? Now, this is me as a young man talking in aspiration. So I don't want people to think like, oh, we've arrived at this place. Everything's cool. Everything's killer. We're talking aspirationally here, what we desire and what we hope and what we're pushing people toward. But what I would say, man, is I think sometimes the longer you stay in a spot, the harder it is to maintain a healthy identity apart from it. So the longer you stay in a space, the harder it is for you to actually maintain a healthy identity apart from it. And I'm not bashing longevity. I'm saying it makes it tricky in a success-driven society to actually be in a space of health and to be in a space of pure identity, because the longer you stay in, the more closely tied your identity becomes to that position, to that space, to that church, to that mission, to that vision. That's why I think some denominations do it very healthy, where they move people around. You're there for 2-3 years, then they reassign you. Some denominations, they assess you after every year. You got to stand and give an account, and then they reassign you. I think that's healthy, because what ends up happening is if you're in a space for 10 years and nobody says, hey, how are you really doing? They can look at the numbers and say, oh, okay, the numbers are killing. But the reality is, if you're not pressing in, it's easy to kind of hide under that cloak of success, when actually, no, you should have probably discerned with your elders, with your group, with your mentors, with your overseers and counselors, and actually transition to something else. That's where I think some of this is like very tough, because I'm watching people who have been in spaces for 30, 40, 50 years. And I'm like, man, I wonder if, because clearly they were a blessing, not just to the local church, but they were a blessing to the body of Christ as a whole, to the kingdom. I wonder if it would have been better for them to transition to another role and still have beautiful impact, but not get so tied up with that position. That's something as a young man who's very new at all this in comparison, trying to figure that out.
Okay. That's good. I think that also.
But you don't think that goes far enough. You don't think that goes far enough.
I know, but I do want to say that I think that that's good. You know what I mean? I think that, accountability is important. I think the mindset of how do you stay mobile, so that you kind of, to some extent, you gain that accountability of multiple communities looking in on, what's going on, your style, like what worked in one church probably won't work in another church, but maybe that's because you shouldn't have been doing it in the first church, in the first place, or it could just be, whatever it may be. So I think that's interesting. I think that's good. Here's my thing though. Like, it's hard for me. Like, I've always been of the mindset of looking at things from a very bigger scale. And I think the healthy pastor is one who looks at a small scale. So I think we and I'm not a pastor, so I think we represent two vantage points from this standpoint. And I can't help, when I think of mega churches in particular, as a kid who was born in the 80s, so therefore a kid of the 90s, I'm aware of the impact of the megachurch in America. And I've seen specifically how organizations that may not be tied to megachurches, but are strongly influenced by megachurch style pastors, pastoral influences, that sort of thing. So think organizations like Focus on the Family, or organizations, or any kind of big Christian movement that we experienced 90s era, even up until now. And the way in which that'll catch on like wildfire when a lot of these megachurches get on it, or a lot of these influential pastors or people get going on it. You yourself, as somebody who was brought up in a university that is very tied to, pastors with national influence, let's say.
Absolutely. For sure.
I think if the average person on the street, they're going to look at these megachurches, they're going to look at these large impact pastors, and they're going to tie them very directly to American influence, be it on the culture, be it on our politics, at every single level. Sure. And egregiously, they would be accurate. That's true. These churches kind of represent Christianity in America. These pastors, for all of their varying agreements, disagreements, denominational positions, when they're at that level, they represent what Christianity is in America. The American church is very tied to like the states, right? The politics of the day. So I'm going to make a weird connection here, but this is the lens through which I see things, right? This is if people have heard me on occasion on this podcast and remember me over the years, then this isn't going to come too crazy, but I'm going to make this jump here. I oftentimes look at the American church through the lens of Star Wars. And what I mean by that is,
of course you do.
No, go with me. I'm asking for some grace, and I'm asking for some creative imagination.
Cook. I love Star Wars. Come on, cook.
This is the thing. Like it's both and, right? Because so much about Star Wars and kind of the larger meta narrative of Star Wars has to do with the concept of faith, and also, as it expanded beyond just the concept of faith, it explored the concept of religion. In the original trilogy, we see Luke Skywalker kind of going on this kind of faith journey, right? Finding the Force, this kind of cultural connection to his father, the way that his father abused it, and then he steps into it. He has to learn to trust it completely, and goes out to Yoda, is trained in it, and ultimately becomes the last of his faith to then go on and share it, right? That's how, if you kind of step into Star Wars at its origins, that's kind of the core of the story. Then the prequel series comes out and people hate it because it's all like a bunch of minutia and everything else. But that, if we had been paying attention, we'd learned so very much, because what do we see in the prequels? We see an exploration, not of the faith, but of the religion. And we see a religion that is very tied to the state. And ultimately what ends up happening, I've actually been thinking about this lately, wondering if, in Star Wars, you're given the concept of the Jedi and the Sith, and the idea they're these different kind of opposing like faiths. But are they different denominations of the same faith? Aren't they ultimately kind of pointing back to the Force? And don't we see to some extent this kind of, the theology of the Sith working its way, manipulating the Jedi, and then ultimately the Jedi crumbling in on itself and burning to the ground? You know what I mean? With what happens with the Sith. That might be a little bit of a side, but just something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But ultimately, like, you look at what's going on in the prequel era. You have the Jedi who are going out acting like cops. Like the Acolyte series that's out right now, there's a lot of different criticisms about it. I'm not going to go into all that because I don't like hating on Star Wars. I like enjoying Star Wars. Even the Star Wars I don't particularly like that much. But regardless, like, a lot of the criticism is around the way in which the Jedi are kind of portrayed as cops. And I don't like seeing the Jedi like that. But the reality is that this is what ends up happening, is kind of these morality police, and also ultimately this tool of the state to apply religion. Now, take it outside of Star Wars into the real world. This has always been the case throughout like the history of mankind, right? Even if I'll push it back to like Greek mythology, you look at the origins of Greek mythologies, you have, as this empire starts growing, or the Roman Empire, as they start growing, they go to all of these different communities and they say, oh, what do you worship? Oh yeah, he's the cousin of our God. So you're with us. Right. Religion is literally used to kind of be this centralized focus to bring everybody together around getting behind what the state is doing. And so that has been the case since the origins of America, and it continues to be. The thing that is lacking in the religion is the very person and deity and savior that the religion is based around.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the biggest things about, to kick it back to Leave Loud, obviously I was very much in the background during all of that. But one of the things that was very interesting is the way in which people seem to not realize that leaving a church is not the same as leaving the faith.
Right.
As turning your back on your church is not the same as turning your back on Christ, especially when your church has turned its back on Christ.
Right.
You're actually focusing where you're supposed to be focusing for all different reasons. And I realized that the Leave Loud
really
movement got, kind of latched on by the Evangelical and deconstructionist movement and everything else. And that has its own problems. But at the same time, it also became something of a tool that, the way in which it all played through together. But anyway, so when you look at, now bringing it back to Star Wars, and I'm sorry, man, I'm going to kick it back to you in a second.
No, go, cook.
When you think about when the Jedi were at their most righteous, when they were at their most correct, it was when they were destroyed. It was when the order was broken down. And we see these few Jedi masters humbled, not in their literally their ivory tower, making decisions for the rest of the galaxy and sending out their people to go and, deploy everywhere. But when they're literally in the swamps, in the bayou, and it wasn't just Luke, there were other Jedi and Force sensitive people who had to come out and seek out the masters to learn from them. And they're not learning the dogma, and they're not learning the structure. What they're learning is the truth of their faith, the purity of the faith. And so where is the pastor that exists, not in that celebrity fashion, not even in this like structural organizational fashion, but in that line of humility that exists solely to point to Jesus, to point to truth, that this is how we should then live, is by following Christ. And so that's my Star Wars analogy. And so the broader application then is it just the mega church that needs to go, or is it the American church that needs to go?
Right.
Pastor.
It's an easy question, right? Anybody who watches me or it's a big thing, as I always say, like I don't craft messages for people to watch them who are not in my local community. Yeah. That's not my intention. If you do, you do. I don't really craft those messages for that purpose. I'm crafting it around what I feel like, God is saying to our church specifically. But what I would say is, I think that in that analogy, there is a spiritual warfare to what we do, but then there's also a hidden power to what we do. And as pastors, if we are not aware, most pastors are aware of the spiritual warfare. So you see, there's like two different kind of responses to whenever these major scandals or falls happen. One side of it is, people will lean over into impression management, right? So there's a bunch of, for every one fallen pastor, there's 1,000 great pastors, and the need to defend the institution, right? To kind of rally around the institution, protect the institution's credibility, but also protect your own bottom line, right? Because people will ask questions about your church because of someone else's situation, right? That's just a natural knee-jerk reaction a lot of people have, is just impression management. But so we'll acknowledge the spiritual warfare side, which I think is 1,000% true. I'm a Pentecostal. Come on, of course. Then there's another side of it, which is that
Pentecostal, the true Jedi pastor.
Definitely not. But then there's another side of it, right? And the other side of it is there's a power to what we do. We have, by nature of the role, you are stepping into a role of unusual power and authority, unusual influence, by nature of simply being a pastor. And so I think the problem often lies is we get into this thing and we think, oh, I'm going to protect myself against the unusual power and authority. I'm not going to fall into that. I'm not going to. And I think the better thing is, no, it was there when you arrived. It doesn't matter if you pastoring 50 people or 5,000. You have that. people literally hang on your words. You do a 40-minute lecture every week. You know, you lead people, you encourage people. Some people make decisions about their jobs, their families, their relationships based upon what you say. People give money or don't give money based upon what you say. This is an unusual power for one person to have. If you do not establish and acknowledge that that is unusual power, you will succumb to it. And I think this is part of part of using your analogy is that when people are like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what we do. We're going to establish, okay, you want to, okay, you're good. Nah, this is some darkness in you. But we'll work that out. That's fine. There's some darkness in you, but we're going to work that out. It's cool. When you think you have grasped the power enough to wield it skillfully, you've missed the point. Like you failed.
Right.
You think you wield it skillfully. No, you don't. Like
that is the lesson. I see what
it's always more than you.
Hmm.
It's always bigger than you. It's always more challenging than you think. And it doesn't matter if you've been there for 50 years. Doesn't matter if you have a 10,000 member church. Doesn't matter if you've been there for 5 years and you got a 500 member church. It doesn't matter. It's too big for us. And I think that's a lot of the issue when we talk about failure or what's obsolete or what's not or what have you. It's just not acknowledging the power that's been placed in our hands and trying to figure out how do we actively divest and actively transfer and actively redirect that power so that we do not hold it all. And this is the thing, if we hold on to it all, if we cling to that power, it will by necessity corrupt us. There's just no way around it. There's no way around it. We'll end up leading people and we'll do it with the purest intentions. Do you know what I mean? People like, this is the thing. Like, so when you say accountability is important, but like, I know a lot of white Christian nationalist pastors that have accountability.
This is what I was, yeah. Exactly.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, so it's like, yo, what does accountability do if you haven't addressed your childhood trauma? What does accountability do if you haven't repented of your sin of xenophobia or racism or homophobia or whatever it is? So it's like, what does accountability matter if you're not doing the work? Like, so accountability, it like, what does that mean? Right. But I think honestly, if you haven't grasped,
like
exactly,
because that's what it is. And if the shared mission isn't truth, isn't following Christ, which I would argue from my vantage point, a lot of churches seem to get so far from that. Maybe they started there, but
yeah, of course, it's easy. Mission drift is real, man. Like all of it.
I think mission drift is natural. To me, I see this is the thing, and this is where I'm still at. I don't see it as not the natural growth of any, like ultimately where it goes.
And I think, Beau, what's really fascinating about all of this is I've come to realize and embrace that what we do as pastors is very important, but we are not that important.
Mm-hmm.
Like what we do is important, but the importance is not within us. I'll tell you a story. I don't know. Some people, if you follow me, again, at Burns Clan, follow at your own risk. I talked about this on IG, but I was doing a funeral recently. And so I did a funeral recently. Did you see the whole funeral situation?
I didn't see
that. Okay, cool. So that's perfect. I'd love to see your face and your reaction to this. So I was doing a funeral recently, and it was a couple that had been to our church, had been attending our church pre-pandemic, and then a little bit during the pandemic, and then a little bit post-pandemic. But the wife she was navigating being a caretaker for her aunt. And so her aunt required her to kind of have round the clock care for her and things like that. And so she would take over nights, she would keep her, and it would just be very difficult for her to kind of lock into a ministry because she was just so tired all the time.
Right.
And so she reached out and said, "Hey, Pastor, my aunt tragically just died of a heart attack. Her heart just stopped." And she said, "We're having trouble finding anybody to do the funeral, to preach the eulogy, because she wasn't an official member of a church." And so this is I think the second or third time it's happened with this particular family. So I've I've stepped in and done the eulogy, even though I didn't know the people who I was doing the eulogy for, or like give what's it's more so called words of comfort, right? When you don't know the person, you don't act like you knew the person, obviously, but you just give some words of comfort for the family. And so she said, would you be willing to do it next Saturday? I said, oh yeah, of course. Like I'm in town, I'll make it work, you know. And so she put me in contact with the deceased husband, her widower. And so I reached out to him, talked to him, and he said, yeah, you did my brother's funeral. And I didn't know that. Like I wasn't holding it to, I wasn't putting two and two together. It's like, yeah, you did my brother's funeral. Really appreciate you preaching. So I really wanted you to do you, you know, and just encourage us in a difficult time. And he talked about memories of his wife and things of that nature. And so I get there on Saturday, and as is common with Black funerals, Black church funerals, you're not going to see the program until you get there, typically. So the first thing I asked the funeral home director is, hey, where's the program? So the order, so I have it. So I go in there, my name's not on there for doing the words of comfort. So I'm like, okay, cool. So I was like, bet. glad I looked at this before. So then a lady walks up and she says, are you Pastor Burns? I said, oh, you're Pastor so-and-so. And she was like, yeah. She said, my sister is the one who died. I'm the sister of the woman who died. So I said, oh, are you doing the words of comfort? And she said, no, I don't have to. I said, no. I said, Pastor, it's totally fine if you do the words of comfort. And she said, no, honestly, Pastor, it would be good for me to process on my own, and you take that. I would like to kind of lead parts of the funeral if that's okay. I said, this is your show. You tell me what you want me to do, what you don't. I said, if you change your mind midstream, just lean over and tell me. I'm okay. You know, it's not that serious. So she does, and she does a phenomenal job. And in terms of leading the first part of the funeral, I read and prayed and did a couple of things. And then you get to the time of reflections, right? So people can come up and say a reflection or a memory about the deceased. And so she said, 2 minutes for everybody except for you, points to the deceased only son and says, you can take as much time as you feel like you need. So he gets up and he starts speaking. And, you know, it's very emotional. He was kind of like, his voice would trail off. His voice would he'd kind of lean back and be like, man, I can't believe I'm doing this. Can't believe, you know, she's in the coffin, everything. And so we would do the Black church thing. It's okay, brother. It's all right. You know, take your time. And so he said, I think that's about it. And everybody was getting ready to clap. He said, I think that's about it. He said, oh, by the way, he said, oh, when it comes to the sermon, yeah, I'd rather hear y'all talk than him preach. And he points to me. And I was just like, oh, I was like, what happened? He's like, yeah, he's like, y'all can hear a sermon tomorrow, but like, he didn't even know her, but y'all did.
Oh.
And so I was like, oh, okay. You know, I was just like, hey, great. You know, but what was odd about it was nobody like went with it. So he was like encouraging people to come up and say stuff, basically to take over my time.
Interesting. Yeah,
but nobody went with it. So her sister leans over and says, no, you're going to still preach because that's what her husband wanted. Her husband wanted you to preach. You're going to still preach.
Oh, no.
So I said, are you sure?
You've been part of the conversation since before you showed up. It
sounds like, right. Yeah. And so I was like, are you sure? Like, because I don't have to, I said, again, like, I don't have to do the words of comfort. So there's another song, and then I'm supposed to get up and preach. Nobody from the family really comes up to say anything else. There were two people that were outside the family that were already prepared to say something. And so when that song is going on, the son gets up and leaves. And then he doesn't come back till after I finish preaching. So I was racking my brain. I was like, do I know this dude? Have I run into dude? Did something happen? Did I not? And so the only thing I could say when I got up is I said, hey, her son is absolutely right. What you all say to each other matters far more than what I'm going to preach. today. I was just asked to give some words of comfort by her husband, and it's my desire just to fulfill the family's wishes. But please don't take it to mean that my words are more important than y'all's words to each other. Your words to each other are going to carry so much more weight. Um, and I preached, and then 4 of his cousins made decisions to follow Jesus.
Wow.
Which was cool, but like that wasn't even the point. The point was clearly this young man who's in a state of grief does not want to hear from a pastor.
Right.
I did not know him. We had no prior interactions, and I was able to confirm that later.
It's what you represented.
But it's what I represented.
Yeah.
So see, the work, it was a beautiful reminder from the Lord. Oh, I'm not that important. The work is really important because the work can cause somebody to literally push off what they would desire to hear in a moment of difficulty.
Huh.
But me as the quote unquote, the pastor, I'm not that important.
Interesting.
You see, like, so it's this dance of when you start to believe in your own importance and not the work. Okay, what I do matters eternally. But when you start to believe I am the pastor, and I'm not saying this is anybody's scenario, any of the people, I'm not saying that's the scenario. I'm saying this is the warning. When you start to believe you are important, when we start to believe we are important, not the work being important, not the savior being important, not the exaltation being important, not the care of the people being important. We start to believe we are important. Yikes, bro.
Yeah.
God will humble you and then remind you, yo, you're not that important, man. Like, who like it was such a beautiful reminder. This, right? Yeah, I get the stones to do this, man. I could have nature preach a better sermon than you. I could have the angels in heaven sing better than your choir or your praise team or whoever.
Right.
Like what I am co-laboring with you because I've created you for a specific mission to exalt me, but it is not a matter of I just needed you to do this. And I think that's been a beautiful heart check for me, and will continue to be, man, that man, we not that important. And I think that's the real danger. You know, people are talking about megachurch. I think sometimes we have the wrong, we miss the forest for the trees here. Like, I think, yes, it is true for us to have common sense conversations about our business tactics in the church and our accountability and our structure and our longevity and our succession and our power distribution. But why are we here? Anybody can lose the plot about why we're here. And we're not here to be centered around a personality or a person. The only person that we're centered around is Jesus. You know, so I've seen now that I think for all of us, if we start believing in our own importance, which is very, and I say this as somebody who's trying to actively confront this, dog, it's so easy. Which gets to your point.
And we want to be that king, right? Like
exactly. Which gets to your point, which is, does the American church need to die? It's what Eddie Glaude asked. Is the Black church dead? And I remember when I had a conversation with him, he said, well, brother, when I say is the Black church dead, you got to understand, like, you can't have a resurrection without a crucifixion. So he said, man, he said, let it die so it can be born better.
Yeah.
Let it die so it can live in its true form. Let whatever we've erected as our monument pass away.
There it is. Yes.
Let that, oh yeah, sure, let that die so that the true can live.
This is making me want to pull back up because that episode, what was that, circa 2019? Is the Black church dead? I don't know. That might
it might have been 2017, 2018, actually.
Maybe it was. I don't know. I can find it. That might have to be a throwback episode sometime. We've been sprinkling those throughout. Man, Thank you, Pastor, for letting me come on here and challenge the existence of your career.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing it. I think it's important. And again, this exists in so many different contours, nuances, denominational affiliations, cultural dynamics, structures. It exists in so many different things, but I think it's a necessary conversation for us to keep having. You notice, like people notice we've been having conversations about the state of the church. We need to continue having those conversations. And I think that's the natural extension of what it means to leave loud from unhealthy racist spaces and actually say, what is the healthy space that we could actually belong to without allowing that to become our sole identity? I think that's necessary. So thank you for asking these questions today.